Sir, you are reminded that you're still under affirmation.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Mohan.
Thank you, my lord. My lord, Professor Nutt prepared some slides which he wanted to use for illustrative purposes during the course of his evidence.
Yes.
During the course of last week on the 28th, those slides were printed out and delivered to the defendants.
Yes.
With your lordship's leave, hand them up to your lordship, and perhaps they could be slotted in. I think they would fit more neatly somewhere in the plaintiff's expert bundle.
Perhaps with the summary of Professor Nutt?
I believe so, my lord. We have additional copies for my learned friends.
Yes.
Given my lord, it seems that there's some grumblings about whether they've received it or not, my lord. We do have the covering letter, if that will assist my learned friends as well, under which it was sent. It was emailed.
It's not grumbling a lot. We just, yes.
I think it says rumbling.
Yes, it's not the grumbling a lot.
Yes.
Let's be careful with our language, please.
Yes.
We haven't received this. We've seen this for the first time, and it's a fact.
I see. Do you require a few minutes to
Yes, to have a look at
peruse
it.
them?
Yes.
I'll adjourn for 5 minutes. That's
Yes.
fine. The court will adjourn.
We take no issue, my lord.
Thank you, Mr. Lokaba. Mr. Mohan.
Thank you, Lord. I've similarly been informed by Mr. Willis.
Mr. Thank you.
Lord, might I hand up a copy for the witness?
Yes.
My Lord, I would suggest that it be slotted in immediately after the end of the summary of Professor Nutt and before his CV. Your Lordship will see that the slides have their internal pagination running from 1 to 34. I would suggest, my Lord, that it simply be numbered 148.1 to 148.34. And we will obviously, during the next adjournment, my Lord, attend to the full pagination of your Lordship's papers.
Yes. You may proceed.
Thank you, Lord. Professor Nutt, you wanted, for the purposes of your evidence, to use these slides. Could I ask you now to do so and tell us what this is all about?
Thank you. So these slides are taken from a talk that, a series of talks I've given over the years, and they really distill the essence of the arguments I will make. So if you go to the first slide, it says drugs are controlled because, and this simply puts out the major factors which I believe have led to the current situation we have in relation to the control of many drugs, not just cannabis. So drugs are controlled under national, international conventions because they are harmful. Sometimes they're controlled because they might be harmful, where we don't have evidence of harm. Unquestionably, there are significant influences from the media. Politicians have, for centuries, had quite an influence on the thinking and decision-making around drug harms. So these decisions are often made by politicians rather than by medical or other experts. And of course the public. There are members of the public who believe that the control of drugs is necessary and useful. So it's a complicated question, and there isn't a single, for any of these questions, a single simple answer. So turning to the next slide. In my view, there are 4 key issues that need to be discussed when one is looking at a regulatory system of drugs that involves legal sanctions. And these are the 4 issues: the relative harms of drugs, particularly comparisons with drugs which are legal and in some countries actively marketed, like alcohol and tobacco; comparative harms versus other risky activities. We heard Mr. Mahon talk yesterday about the fact that many activities are risky, but they're not illegal, even though many of them may be, or some of them, may be more risky than cannabis. And then there's the issue of proportionality, where drugs can be shown to do harm, and where society or governments has decided that criminal sanctions are appropriate to deter harm. Those should be proportionate to the harms, as they are for other sanctions. So one could potentially say, I would say, that putting people in prison for life, as can happen in some countries, or even executing them for the possession of drugs, is disproportionate to the harms that drugs could do in most cases. And then finally, there's a question for lawyers and the legal system: does the law achieve what it's supposed to achieve? Do the laws on drugs actually improve the quality of life of our society? Now, I am only going today to talk about the first one, because that's the one where I have expertise and where I have done my research. The others are really subject to other discussions, but they are relevant and one should bear them in mind.
When you say the first one, the one that you refer to as relative harms of drugs.
That is correct. I'm not going to talk about the others. I certainly have done some research on number 2, comparative harms of drugs versus other risky activities, and if Your Lordship wanted, I could talk about that. And I could also talk about the proportionality of penalties relating to health harms. But today I'm going to focus on number one, the relative harms of drugs, and with a particular emphasis, obviously, on the comparative harm of cannabis in comparison with other commonly used drugs, including alcohol and tobacco. The next slide emphasizes the challenges that we have to deal with when we are trying to come to rational decisions about the harms of drugs and how we might control drugs. And the big problem we have is that when a drug is illegal, collecting data is difficult. So the data we have is usually, in fact, almost always, of poorer quality than the data we have if we're looking at legal drugs, such as alcohol and tobacco and caffeine. So that is a challenge. And that challenge then means we cannot simply apply the same statistics that we might have. So for alcohol, for instance, we know from health audits the number of people who die each year as a result of the side effects of drinking. But with a drug like cannabis, it's much harder to get that data because it's not collected in the same way. And that means we have to think in different ways about how we might try to estimate the harms of drugs which are illegal. The illegality itself means that information gathering is less good, and therefore we need to work out ways we can overcome that problem. And the next slide shows how we attempted to do this.
You're now on slide page 4, 148.4.
That's correct. So the drug science, drug harms, MCDA analysis model.
Tell us again what MCDA is.
So MCDA stands for Multi-Criteria Decision Analysis. And this is a technique which has become well established in the last 2 decades as an approach to problems which fall into different spheres of evidence. It's an approach which allows comparisons to be made across very different scales, in this case of harms. And I will show you later how we do that. But it's a very well-established technique for dealing with complicated, multifaceted questions where there is not a single dimension of impact or harm.
Before we turn to the next slide, there is a reference that's given there, a multi-criteria decision analysis, Lancet 376. Tell us what Lancet is.
So the Lancet is one of, if not the leading medical journal in the world. It's a very long established journal, several hundred years of publishing cutting-edge medical research. It's the, alongside the New England Journal of Medicine, it's the journal that most doctors would see as the top journal in their discipline. Shall I turn to the next slide?
Yes.
So the next slide shows the core basis on which the assessment of drug harms was made. And this is quite complicated. I want to talk you through it slowly. What you see there is what's called a decision tree. You will see on the right-hand side 16 variables ranging at the top, drug-specific mortality, to at the bottom, community damage.
If you could just for a moment, I see that you refer to drug-specific mortality, but that seems to be abbreviated. If you could just go through, just so that we know the abbreviations, what the full name is for each of them. For example, the first one you say, it reads drug-spec mort.
Sorry, yes, I can spell those out for you. I'm just checking. I think if you go to page 164,
the plaintiff's expert bundle.
Yes, page 166, you will see the definitions of all of them there. So it may be simpler if people just have that page open when I'm speaking.
Thank you. But while we're on that, the document you've referred us to commences at page 164 of that bundle. It's marked Annexure B. It's entitled Drug Harms in the UK, a Multi-Criteria Decision Analysis. Just so that we know what we're dealing with, could you tell us what this document is?
Yes, so this is the Lancet article. So this is a photocopy of the published article. And this article is a report of the research we did in a format suitable for the journal. So it's not the full report, it doesn't contain all the individual data points, but they are available if you require, and they are available on the Drug Science website. But this is the final output of the report I'm going to describe. And to understand that, I need to take you through the process. So if I can ask you to turn to page 166. 166 contains the different parameters or the different criteria of harm that any drug might cause. And I think it's important to understand where these have come from. So I mentioned yesterday that for the previous 15 years I had been working myself and also with the government to try to provide a matrix, a template against which drug harms could be assessed in a reliable, consistent and transparent way. And originally I had a 9-point matrix, and as a result of an earlier Lancet paper, I was approached by Professor Larry Phillips from the London School of Economics, who was an expert on multi-criteria decision analysis. And he suggested that we use this approach. And this research was funded by the Medical Research Council in the UK and also by the Home Office. And it's a two-stage process. The first stage is to have a conference of experts which look at what the variables are that need to be assessed. So that was a 2-day conference, 40 experts locked away in a conference centre outside London and asked to think of every possible harm that they could think of that a drug could do. And they write it down typically on a post-it, stick it on the wall. At the end of the first day you have something like 3,000 different ideas as to what harms drugs might do. And then the second stage is to consolidate those 3,000 harms into the key ones that cover them all. And it turns out that when you condense them down, you end up with the 16 harms you see here. And if you look at the table on page 166, you'll see on the left-hand side are the 9 harms to the user, and on the right-hand side the 7 harms to society. So it turns out that there are 16 variables, 16 parameters or criteria which will cover all the harms that drugs might do. And these range from the top of the page, you see drug-specific mortality and
You're
moving
reading from page 166.
Yes, and so these are the full specifications of the abbreviations on page 5 of my slides.
That's 148.5.
And not only do they give you the full title for each of these criteria, but they also give you the definition. And this is important because obviously the definition is critical for assessing any drug according to these particular criteria. And if you go to the slide, page 5, the slide, you'll see that those are on the right-hand side of the page, and they condense into 5 separate subgroups: physical, psychological, social to the user, physical, psychological, and social to others. And those then condense down into 1.9 harms to users and the other 7 harms to others. Now this process is a challenging process. It requires expertise and time, and eventually was written up as a government report and published on the Home Office website. So this is now seen to be the best, the most sophisticated, the most detailed and transparent way in which one can assess drug harms, because it covers every possible harm. If you see on page 4, the bottom, it goes from community damage, how drug use affects a community, going upwards, the economic cost to society.
I think you meant page 5. Is
Page
that right?
5, so sorry, yes, it's page 5. So each of these harms has a definition, and drugs can then be compared according to their damage on each of these criteria. And it's turned out, as I will show you later, to be widely accepted internationally as the standard for doing drug harm assessments.
Yes, please continue.
The next slide, slide 6, just shows you two of the instigators, developers of this multi-criteria decision approach. And the reason it's so clever and the reason it can be applied to drug harm assessments is that it takes topics, areas of harm or areas of effect, which have completely different dimensions. So let me give you an example. The likelihood of a drug killing you every time you take it is a numeric value. We know that if you inject heroin over a lifetime, you have about a 15 to 20% chance of dying as a result of that injection. No other drug has that high level of likelihood of killing you when you first inject, except perhaps some new opioids. But then on the other, so you have a figure there. You have a 15% lifetime mortality from injecting the drug. You can then apply that to any drug, the likelihood of dying when you first smoke tobacco or cannabis, and I'll show you that later on. But that's a very different measure to the economic cost. Economic costs of drug use are measured in rand or pounds or dollars, whereas likelihood of dying is measured as a percentage. So these are completely separate measurements. How do you bring them together? Well, you bring the multi-criteria decision analysis approach brings them together by using a criteria of what we call here the value added from that knowledge or that impact. And I will explain to you how we do that, because it's not straightforward, so I will talk you through that. But the essence is to turn all these variables into a scale which we call a ratio scale, a ratio of harm. And when you have ratios, you can compare them regardless of what the underlying unit of measurement was. So I'll give you an example as I come through. So in the UK, the second conference, so the first conference was convened to determine how many harms of drugs there are and how to define them. And then the second conference, using many of the same people, but not all, I think about 24 individuals here, ranging from people who are interested in education through to toxicologists and the police. The second conference, another 2-day conference, evaluated the 20 drugs that you see on slide 7. So these are 20 drugs that were considered because they had significant relevance to the United Kingdom situation on drugs. And they range, you can see at the top left, from heroin going across crack, cocaine and alcohol, drugs where we have considerable concerns about their use, including tobacco, amphetamines. Mephedrone was a new stimulant that was hitting the UK market about that time, about which we had relatively little data. We thought it was very important to try to get an estimate of its harms in order for the government to consider how it might regulate it if it needed to. Buprenorphine, often called Subutex. This is the opioid substitute treatment, which is now very widely used around the world, but can be misused. Benzodiazepines, drugs like Valium, which are medicines that are often misused. Cannabis. Anabolic steroids, these are medicines which are used by bodybuilders or people who want to create better body shape. Ecstasy, which is a stimulant called MDMA in its true chemical name. Ketamine, a licensed anesthetic agent and painkiller, which is now being abused in Britain. LSD, a psychedelic. Magic mushrooms, another naturally occurring psychedelic. LSD is a synthetic psychedelic. Mushrooms are native fungi which have psychedelic ingredient called psilocybin. Methylamphetamine, which you call tick. Cat, which is a chewable stimulant that's used largely in East Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia and Kenya, but was being used and is used in our Somalian communities in the UK. Butane. Butane, of course, is a gas which is in lighter fuel, but which is abused often by very young people and causes significant number of deaths. Methadone, which is a synthetic opioid largely used in the UK as a treatment for heroin dependence, but in other countries like the USA, it's used widely as a painkiller. It was developed as a painkiller, as an alternative to morphine, has longer actions in morphine. So in some countries it's used as a painkiller, and in some countries as an alternative treatment for heroin abuse, and in some countries it's used for both. And then finally GHB, this is gamma hydroxybutyrate, often known on the streets as GBH, grievous bodily harm. This is a powerful sedative, rather like alcohol and benzodiazepines. It's also a medicine. So we covered the spectrum of legal drugs and illegal drugs, medical drugs, non-medical drugs, and drugs which have quite a lot of use, and drugs which have, or were having at the time, not so much use. Shall I go on? So there are two stages to this multi-criteria decision process. The first stage is the scoring stage. So we have these 16 criteria, and for each of those, we score them on this scale you see here, the 0 to 100 scale. And the way it works is this, is that the most harmful drug is given a score of 100. So the committee sit round, it's called a Delphic process, it's a process of expert interrogation of each other. The way it works is that the moderator says to all the experts, what do you think in your mind, don't say it, think in your mind, what is the most harmful drug? So they think, because if they say it out loud, other people get affected by the other experts. So you think in your mind what the most harmful drug is, and then he says, right, write down what you think the most harmful drug is. They write it down, and then we look to see what the decision is. And in this case, it's pretty straightforward, because if you're taking a drug, or in the case of drug-specific mortality, then it will be heroin, because as I've explained, heroin is the one most likely to kill you when you use it. But for each of those criteria, you select the most harmful drug. And then all the other drugs are scored on a 0 to 100 scale as a proportion of the agreed harm in relation to the most harmful drug. So if we were to take mortality again, the likelihood of dying when you first use the drug, drug-specific mortality, heroin would be at the top, 100. And then you might say, how harmful is methadone? What's the likelihood of dying when you took methadone, each time you take methadone? And that will be scored. And you can see, I haven't got the raw data here, but for every drug is put on that scale in relation to its relative harm to heroin. So a drug that is scored as half as harmful as heroin will score 50. And a drug that's scored as 1/100th as harmful as heroin will score 1. And some drugs score 0. So you have...
Is that process undertaken in regard to each of the criterion?
Yes.
So by the criterion I refer to those listed on page 166, drug-specific mortality, drug-related mortality, and on the right-hand side, crime, environmental damage, etc.
So every one of those has a scale like this developed with all 20 drugs placed. And this is done, I say, by consensus. It's a Delphic process. The experts make their recommendations, and then if they disagree, there is discussion, there is argument, and eventually a consensus, almost always a consensus develops. But if a consensus doesn't develop, we are at the end of the process able to provide a separate score based on the difference. We can actually look to whether that difference in agreement has an impact on the final score, and then you can have two final scores if you want. But largely, people agree because when you're thinking about relative harms, it's much easier than thinking about absolute harms. So we do that. It's a big process because you see there are 20 drugs and there are 16 of these criteria. So that takes about a day to go through that process. I want to give you just a couple of examples because will illustrate the kinds of data that we might use when we are working to generate these relative harm scales. So the next slide, slide 9, this looks at the time when this work was being done. This is 2009 in the UK. We're interested in what drugs kill people. And these are data we have from our government looking at the proportion of people who have a premature death from the range of drugs you see there. And you see on the left-hand side, tobacco is responsible still for 80,000 premature deaths. Alcohol at that time for about 8,000. Opiates for just over 1,000. Paracetamol, which we didn't score in our work because it's not really a recreational drug, scores 200. Cocaine was killing 150. Amphetamines about 40. Cannabis maybe 5 or 6, 10. Ecstasy maybe 10 or less. And mephedrone, the new stimulant, 1 or 2. So these data, these are hard data. These tell us the consequence of using a drug in terms of dying. But this doesn't relate to the drug killing you when you take it. This, of course, relates to the combination of dying when you take it and dying as a result of taking it repeatedly. So tobacco rarely, if ever, kills anyone when they smoke a cigarette. But of course, a cumulative health burden of smoking cigarettes for 20, 30, 40 years is why there is this high mortality. And we separate these two variables. So if you go to slide 10, you will see how we do this. So slide 10 shows actual data. This is a computer screen print for the data on 2 of the parameters or the criteria. The left-hand side is drug-specific mortality. So if you go to page 166 with the definitions, this is the intrinsic lethality of the drug expressed as a ratio of lethal dose and standard dose. So the likelihood of dying as a result of any single use of this drug. And I've explained heroin. You can see heroin, the red arrow shows heroin. That's drug number 2. And if you come across to the data, so the blue bar for number 2, you see heroin goes to the right-hand edge of that box. That's 100. And if you go down to number 6, you'll see tobacco. And you'll see tobacco scores 0. Because, as I said, smoking tobacco almost never kills you. And cannabis, number 8, also scores 0. But then when we look at another criterion, drug-related mortality, the likelihood of dying as a result of using the drug, the extent to which life is shortened by the use of the drug, then we see a very different picture. So we go to the right-hand box.
Before we go there,
Oh, sorry.
Professor Nutt, can we go to page 166 and just have a look at what the definition is of drug-related mortality?
Correct. So this is the extent to which life is shortened by the use of the drug. And of course, the examples for shortening life are traffic accidents with alcohol, lung cancers with smoking, HIV from injecting, and suicide. Those are 4 examples, but of course there are very, very many reasons why using drugs can shorten life expectancy and increase mortality.
And from where is this information obtained?
So this information is obtained from wherever we can get it. Because of course there are different reasons or different causes of mortality. So tobacco causes mortality through lung cancer, through lung disease, chronic obstructive airways disease, through cardiovascular disease, through bladder cancers, etc. Alcohol causes mortality through liver cirrhosis, gut ulcers, cardiovascular disease, brain damage. Different drugs have different mortalities. So this is a composite of the expert estimates of the relative mortality-inducing effects of all those different drugs. Those 20 drugs, you can see there on the right-hand side. You can see that our expert group scored heroin as 100. It's the most likely drug to result in death. And that makes sense. We know that heroin users have a life expectancy on average of 20 years less than the population average. Alcoholics have an average life expectancy of 15 years less. Tobacco smokers have a life expectancy of between 10 and 15 years less. So we know that drug use accelerates mortality. And these are our scores. Heroin 100. Now here, look at tobacco, number 6, which was 0 for drug-specific mortality, the likelihood of dying when you smoke a cigarette, but has now gone up to 90, because tobacco smoking is a very dangerous activity. Half of all people who smoke cigarettes will die of a cigarette smoking related disorder. Cannabis, number 8, you see we scored 20. So unquestionably, cannabis has harms. Cannabis can lead to mortality. That mortality will relate to lung disease, heart disease, psychiatric disease. But where our estimate was that it was 1/5 as harmful in the long term as heroin, and about 1/4 as harmful in the long term as tobacco. Shall I go on?
Yes.
There is another way we can estimate the harms of drugs to help us compare comparative risks and harms. And these are new data, and these are not my data. These are data that have come from these 2 German experts, Dr. Lachenmeyer, who's a toxicologist, and Dr. Jürgen Rehm, who is arguably the world's leading epidemiologist on the harms of drugs. And I know Professor Rehm well. I have published several papers with him on drug harms as measured in communities rather than by expert panels like my own. And I show this because it helps support the arguments I have been making. What they have done here is they have developed another measure which they call the margin of exposure. And this is again a ratio, and it's essentially what we estimated in our drug-specific mortality. But here they have more sophisticated toxicological data. And this margin of exposure, or an MOE, is an estimate of the ratio of the dose which is normally used and the dose that toxicologists tell us is likely to cause harm, or the so-called toxic threshold. Now, This scale is a complicated scale, and I'm going to turn to the next slide in a minute to make it simpler for you, but these are the data they published. And this is a log scale that goes from 1 to 1,000. And for the purposes of today, really, we need to look at the bottom two drugs, alcohol and heroin, where you can see that the right side edge of the red bar, which is the mean threshold of toxicology, is of the region of 1 to 2 times the used dose. And that tells us, particularly for alcohol, that there is no safe dose. That, in fact, every dose of alcohol you take at the level of a drink is going to have some toxic effect on your body. In fact, they have estimated that if you were to treat alcohol the same way as you treat other food ingredients, such as colorants or taste facilitators, the maximum allowable exposure of alcohol to a human being in 1 year would be a glass of wine. And the average drinker is drinking somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times more than that a year. And that is because we ignore the toxicology of alcohol, because so many of us enjoy drinking. But if we applied the same standards as we apply, as I said, to food additives or to food colorants, we wouldn't be allowed or recommended to drink more than a glass of wine a year. If you go to the top of the graph, you see THC. THC, as we heard yesterday, stands for the active ingredient of cannabis. And there you see the margin of exposure is over 100, as compared with 1 or 2 for alcohol. And if you turn to the next page, this is a graph which was drawn up by a journalist to make it simpler for non-mathematicians to understand. So this, instead of having a log scale, this is a linear scale. And you can see that the drugs have here been scored according to high risk, medium risk, and low risk of toxicity. And the high risk drugs have a risk of up to 10. And you can see that alcohol, heroin, cocaine, and tobacco are high risk groups, in that the dose you use means you're at high risk of getting a toxic effect. Whereas cannabis is so different from the others that it's, you could argue it's up to, in this scale, 100 times safer than alcohol per dose you use. Now, there are other harms. There are harms relating to damage, for instance, to injury, if you see here. Injury, the extent to which the use of a drug increases the chance of injuries to others, both directly and indirectly. And these include domestic violence, traffic accidents, fetal harm, drug waste, viruses, etc. Injury also occurs to the user of the drug, and that will be called drug-related damage. And one of the major concerns about drug use and the cause of injury to self and others is the harm of driving. And if you turn to slide 13, this is a graph I took from this very recent UK government report on driving under the influence of drugs. The committee that did this research was chaired by an excellent leading toxicologist, Professor Kim Wolfe from King's College in London. And the graph they present here is a graph which looks at the likelihood of a traffic accident when cannabis and alcohol are detected in the blood of people who've had an accident. So these are data from the real world on road traffic accidents and cannabis versus alcohol. And The axis at the bottom, the x-axis,
That's the horizontal.
the horizontal one, is called an odds ratio. And an odds ratio is simply a likelihood ratio. The vertical dotted line is at 1. That means there's no increase. A drug falling on that line would not increase the risk. Cannabis, you see, is to the right of the line. It has an odds ratio of about 1.8, or just say, let's say 2. So that tells us that driving under the influence of cannabis is likely to double your likelihood of having a road traffic accident. Alcohol, you can see, alcohol is ETOH. That stands for ethanol, which is the chemical term for alcohol. So ethanol in your blood increases the risk by somewhat a bit over 8 times. So having alcohol in your blood gives you an 8-fold increased risk of injury to yourself or passengers from a road traffic accident. And the two together increase the risk probably additively up to about 10 or 12 or 16 times more likely. Now, I show this because it is a very important real-world measure of the comparative harms or risks of alcohol versus cannabis. But I also show it to make the comment at the bottom, in the green box at the bottom. Now, there you will see from some of the defendants' experts that there is an increase in road traffic accidents in cultures where more cannabis is used. That is inevitable because, as I've shown you here, cannabis increases the likelihood of road traffic accidents. However, that does not mean there will be more road traffic accidents, because what we are seeing is that people are switching from alcohol to cannabis. And in fact, in the states in America where they have data, particularly Colorado, on road traffic accidents following the admission of marijuana to the medical formularies, and more recently making marijuana recreationally legal, we have seen very significant falls in the number of people dying on the roads drunk. So yes, cannabis is harmful for driving, but it's significantly less harmful than alcohol, and in populations where there is equal access, the net effect is to reduce deaths on the road from alcohol. So there is the concern that increased use of cannabis will lead to increased road traffic accidents overall is not founded. The next slide looks at the change in the use of cannabis in the United Kingdom over the last 40 years, going back to 1970 when I started my medical training and when we first started collecting data on cannabis use in the UK. And this graph is important for a number of reasons. The first is that it shows a 20-fold increase in the number of cannabis users over those the 30-plus years, going to where the data was last produced, 2003. A 20-fold increase in the number of users, we estimate, is likely to relate to a 50 or even a 100-fold increase in the amount of cannabis used. This graph is very similar to the graphs which we see in all Western countries: America, France, Spain, Germany, the Netherlands. Almost all those countries have seen a 20-fold increase in use over that time period. This has occurred despite the drug being illegal in all of them. And it raises several important questions. And one might imagine that such a massive increase in use would be accompanied by a very marked increase in harms if the drug was harmful. Now, I showed you earlier on that cannabis is, at least in UK, responsible for virtually no deaths, whereas alcohol was responsible for at least 8,000 at the time these data were being collected, and tobacco 80,000. So if cannabis isn't associated, if this massive increase in cannabis use is not associated with more medical harms, how can we in the UK justify keeping cannabis illegal? And the answer is that our government decided to rely on two concerns. The concern about driving, which I've already addressed, and the concern about schizophrenia or psychosis. So a message was promoted that cannabis causes schizophrenia. Now, we can go into this in more detail because there's a huge amount of research on this, and this may be a topic for another time, but I just want to say this. If cannabis did increase schizophrenia, you might imagine that a 20 to 100-fold increase in use would have been manifest in an increase in the number of people with schizophrenia. I mean, we know that a doubling, a twofold increase in the use of alcohol is associated with a fivefold increase in deaths from cirrhosis. So a 20 or 100-fold increase in cannabis would surely have related to some increase in schizophrenia. So we examined this, and we examined it using the best data we have in the UK, which is on the next slide.
Page?
Page 15. And these are data from the Medical Research Council, the leading research group in the UK. They have a database of general practitioners. It includes thousands of different general practices, and it allows us to look at the diagnosis and also the prescribing of drugs for disorders like schizophrenia. Now, I'm going to take you through this because there are 4 separate graphs here. 2 of them relate to prevalence rates, that is the top 2, and the bottom 2, the green and the orange, relate to incidence rates. And it's important you understand the difference because, as we will see from some of the evidence from the defendants, these mean different things and they have different implications for the effects of cannabis. So a prevalence rate is the likelihood of someone having that disorder that year. And an incidence rate is the likelihood of someone developing, starting off with.
Could you just say the first one again? The prevalence rate is
the prevalence rate is the actual, this is the likelihood of someone having that diagnosis in that year. So for instance, if someone develops schizophrenia when they are 24 and it continues till they're 70, every year that person will contribute to the prevalence. Every time that you ask what is that person's diagnosis, it will be schizophrenia. And so that data will contribute to the number of people, or the prevalence of people with schizophrenia. And the rate is per 10,000 patients. The incidence rate is the likelihood, or is the rate at which someone gets the first diagnosis of schizophrenia. So it's lower because, of course, for an enduring disorder like schizophrenia, if someone, once someone's incident, once someone's had an episode and the episode persists, that the incident, the prevalence years will add up, whereas the incident year is only scored once because they only develop the disorder in 1 year. So that's why the prevalence rates are higher, because for chronic illnesses, people are scored year on year. Now, and this is a very important point, and this is very seminal to the whole debate about cannabis and schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a rare disease, less than 1% of the population. And you can see that from the orange bar, the very lower bar. This shows that about 2 people in 10,000 develop schizophrenia each year. Psychosis is a more general term. Psychosis is a term that covers schizophrenia. It covers psychotic disorders which occur in bipolar illness, manic depressive illness. It occurs in disorders which occur in neurological disease, and it covers disorders relating to drug use. So a drug like cannabis will produce a syndrome which is like psychosis, a syndrome of disorganization, of confusion, of perhaps paranoia and delusional beliefs, which is not dissimilar to that of schizophrenia. In fact, cannabis is relatively widely used as a model of schizophrenia, because the symptoms of cannabis use are, at least some of them, are very similar to those of schizophrenia. So when you look at psychosis, you don't know whether you're looking at what we call an organic psychosis, due to the brain being abnormal, or to the effect of the drug. But nevertheless, for both psychosis and schizophrenia, and for incidence, the new cases at the bottom, and prevalence, the ongoing cases, you see that over that period, here from 96 to 2000, over the 10 years in which that population of English or UK people have had a 20-fold increase in the number of cannabis users, there is no increase in psychosis, and there is no increase in schizophrenia. And if anything, by 2005 and 2006, it's going down. So our belief, based on these data, and the same is true where there is data in all Western countries, cannabis cannot cause schizophrenia or psychosis. It can mimic psychosis, but it does not cause schizophrenia.
Would I see it's 11:15, perhaps that's a convenient time to take the exam.
We'll take the tea adjournment.